Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is a special bonus episode about negativity bias and political polarization. As Franklin Pierce Adams pointed out, nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. In today's world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the constant stream of bad news.
Russia's new invincible nuclear-powered missile.
Fake news is becoming more advanced and threatening societies around the world.
Scientists say climate change is getting worse.
We're bombarded with stories about conflicts, natural disasters, and political turmoil. But are things really as dire as they seem? Here's researcher Stephen Rathje.
The presence of one of these negative emotion words in a tweet or a Facebook post will usually predict increased virality or engagement of that post. People will be more likely to share negative posts. My friend and collaborator Claire Robertson in my lab has also recently found that people are more likely to click on news headlines if they have a negative word in the post. So this seems to be an example of what psychologists have called for the past few decades the negativity bias. We sort of selectively attend to negative information. And this is a very well replicated finding. We seem to be biased toward the negative. There even tend to be more negative words in the dictionary than positive words. There are more negative adjectives than positive adjectives. So it seems to be sort of human nature almost to attend more to the negative.
We see things as just getting worse and worse and tend to look back at the past with rose-colored glasses. But the reality is things are better than ever across many areas. Comparing our lives now to the past, they've improved by almost every meaningful measure. Huge numbers of people around the world are living longer, safer, and more prosperous lives. That's certainly true for someone living hundreds of years ago, but even compared to someone living just after World War II, or even a few decades ago, many of us, believe it or not, have never had it so good. Here's cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker.
Despite what you read on the news, humanity has been getting better off. Few of us die of disease and starvation. Few of us are illiterate. Few of us are victims of violent crimes. Few of us die in wars. Few of us live under dictatorships. I mean, things weren't so great in the 1970s when you had civil wars raging all over the world, when you had the war in Vietnam killing 10 times as many people as die in wars today. In the 1980s, when you had the most of the world living in dictatorships behind the Iron Curtain or in military states in Latin America and East Asia. So yeah, there are threats, but the fact that there are threats now doesn't mean that they're worse now. They were pretty bad in the past too. Whether it will continue to get better depends on whether we continue to seek human well-being as our goal, as opposed to, say, the glory of the nation or the race or the faith, whether we continue to develop science and technology, whether we continue to apply reason and not fall back on superstition and fallacies, which we know as psychologists humans are vulnerable to. And by the way, it is economists who tend to be more optimistic, I think because they're more in tune with data showing that societies really do get richer.
And this brings us to our main topic for today. How does negativity bias contribute to the apparently intractable problem of toxic polarization in our society? Our guest today recently published an article on this very topic with the organization Starts With Us, entitled, "Is Toxic Polarization Caused by Our Addiction to Negativity?"
So my name is Travis Monteleone. I'm a full-time private equity investor, but I also write a Substack that focuses on polarization. And I've also worked with several depolarization organizations in the past as a volunteer, including the Ford Party, Braver Angels, and a now defunct organization that I was on the board of called the Burke Payne Society. So I've seen a bunch of those organizations on the depolarization front firsthand.
Monteleone asserts that negativity bias is a major factor contributing to toxic polarization because it causes us to overemphasize negative information and stereotypes about other people and political issues. But fear not, he offers ways to break free and maybe, just maybe, bridge the political divide. Ready to rewire your brain and become part of the solution? Stick around for this insightful conversation. All right. Well, first of all, Travis Monteleone, thank you so much for making time to come on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here, David.
Yeah. So, your paper makes makes sort of the assertion that negativity bias is at the root of a lot of this. And a lot of researchers seem to believe that it's one factor, but, there are other factors like social media algorithms. And you mentioned some of this, and these other things that can play a role. So tell us a little bit about why negativity bias kind of trumps those other factors.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And yeah, for anyone familiar with the depolarization space, as I'm sure all your listeners are, you're very used to hearing that there are a dozen or more different causes of polarization. It's a very complex issue. And I agree with all that. I think it is a very complex issue, but I think at its root, a lot of those kind of proximal causes have an underlying cause, which is negativity bias. And so I'll take three that I think a lot of people point to on a pretty regular basis and talk about those. So if you think about the media, traditional media in general, social media as well, and then what I'll call the political arena. So politicians, political narratives, right? Anything kind of in politics, let's say. So with those three areas, the way that I think about them is that they are all marketplaces. And in a marketplace, you've got suppliers and you've got the demand. And what I write about is that whenever most people think about these marketplaces, they tend to blame the suppliers. So traditional news organizations or social media content creators or politicians, right? But in reality, Econ 101, right? Demand drives supply, and that is the basis of product creation. So what that means is that traditional news organizations, social media, politicians, they're all creating a product, right? Whether that's the news or political narratives or what have you, to meet consumer demand. And in all of those marketplaces, the consumer demand is us. And so we give demand signals to all three of these different groups. They produce products that then we, consume, right, is a good way to think about it. And so if we see products that we don't like, right, which is overly negative and pessimistic narratives, very negative news content, very negative social media coverage, right, all of these products that are overly negative and polarizing and sensationalist that people always point to as the problem, what's really the problem is the underlying demand in each of those marketplaces. And so the reason, in my opinion, that people have such an issue recognizing that is that we like to think that we are rational consumers, that we, really like fair and balanced media, or we are really rational when we think about who to vote for or which policies to get excited about. But, what we know from sociology and psychological research is that we're anything but rational. And this is the entire field of behavioral economics, right? It shows us that we've got all these biases that are affecting the way we think about and view the world. And in politics, first and foremost, the bias that really affects how we view the world is negativity bias. And so for your listeners who may not be familiar with this bias, it's one of a family of cognitive biases that in general really kind of drives it. You can basically think of it as an addiction to negativity. Okay. So in general, we are always going to have a psychological preference for negative news and stimuli. We're going to give those negative news and stimuli more psychological weight than we will positive or neutral versions of the same. And so we're always seeking out and paying more attention to negative at the expense of the good. And so what that means in these three marketplaces is that we are causing the suppliers in those marketplaces, right, the media, social media, and politicians, to produce negative content. And so whenever people are blaming those other, suppliers, I'll call them here, they're really missing the underlying cause, which at the end of the day is us and our addiction to negativity. And the reason that people kind of fail to see that is, again, we like to think that we're rational. Turns out we're not. We've got this bias that drives us towards negativity much more frequently and with much more force than most people are aware.
Yeah, and I understand from some of the folks we've had on, neuroscientists and others, that
there's some ideas that this may come from our evolutionary biology, where it was like necessary to focus on the lion that was going to attack us or whatever, and not the pretty flowers, whatever, right?
Yeah,
and
100%. Yep. Yeah, I mean, it has there's a good reason for it, right? In our evolutionary history, it made a lot of sense and helped us to survive. The difference between recognizing and not recognizing a negative stimuli could be life and death, whereas the difference between recognizing and not recognizing a positive stimuli would just be, a slightly better life. So the negative stimuli always is going to stick out in our brain more. And it's similar to how, our evolutionary desire for things that taste sweet used to be very beneficial for us until we got the ability to mass produce sugar. And now it's actually, a major cause of obesity. And I think of negativity kind of in the same way, right? There's a good evolutionary basis for it. But now that we can mass produce content, whether it's traditional media, social media, or political content, the fact that we're so highly attuned to the negative is actually really working against us and is a major cause of polarization. So,
yeah, and an example, I think we may have used this before on the show, but if you're not quite like getting a sense that this is something that happens to us all, I mean, think about like a performance review, right? You get 5, great pieces where you were excellent or cells or, you were 5 stars or whatever. Then you get the one that's like, well, maybe this area needs improvement. What's the one you think about for the next 3 days, right?
Exactly.
Just one example of that.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because it's such an intuitive idea, in most fields and areas of our life. Like the same thing with memories, right? How memories form. And there's a great literature on even in linguistics, right? That there are a multitude of ways to describe negative concepts that vastly dwarf the ways to describe the opposite positive concept. So, I mean, it affects everything. And, people kind of intuitively grasp that the negative a lot of times is more powerful than the good. But for whatever reason, people just don't talk about it in politics very, very frequently. So, that's an interesting problem. But yeah, I mean, within politics, again, we're not as rational as we think we are. That the negativity bias is a kicker.
Yeah, and social media sort of validates that to a degree because they're just running algorithms. They're not hiring necessarily. They didn't go out to set out to build an algorithm that would feed us this stuff. It was just the stuff we interacted with. And so it's very much a free market of social media, I guess. And those market dynamics just cause that stuff to bubble to the top.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, but you'll still, despite that, you'll still hear all the time people blaming social media for our divisions or the traditional media. And, both of those groups just throw up their hands and say, hey, we're just providing you what you want. It just so happens that what you want is sensationalist and very negative. So yeah, if we're really going to attack the root cause, it's understanding that bias and walking back from it.
Yeah, and there's another version of this that kind of I wanted to talk about just a little bit, because we've talked here about sort of motivated reasoning and that, and particularly in this aspect, I'm thinking of sort of moral motivated reasoning where, we don't just passively consume this negative information, but we actually sort of actively seek it out. We seek out information that, confirms those moral beliefs, right? I mean, we want to see the other side do bad things because it helps us kind of enforce our moral superiority. It makes us, sort of feel like we are on the righteous side.
Yep.
So how do you think that plays out into this or relates back to the negativity bias?
Yeah. There's motivated reasoning, and that's somewhat related to confirmation bias as well, which a lot of people will throw out as another cause of polarization. I think, confirmation bias on its own is, in my mind, not a major cause of polarization, right? If everyone is, let's assume there's a standard distribution of, people's political views and kind of how they view the other side. If you're just confirming your existing belief, there's no mechanism for you to move further towards the poles, either to the left or the right. You're just continuing to confirm your belief, and you might get in a very deep rut, and it might be very hard for you to kind of switch positions. But that's not necessarily polarizing. That's just kind of ossifying. And we really, don't see that, right? Like right now, there's a massive party realignment going on. And at the same time, people are moving towards the poles, both ideologically, but also just in terms of effective polarization. So the amount of distrust and contempt we have for the other side seems to be growing. And so, in my mind, the confirmation bias on its own can't be that mechanism. It's got to be negativity bias, which continues to push us out. Because I mean, whenever we see that negativity, again, we're honing in on that, and our view of the other side, either their ideological opinions or they themselves as people, continues to get more and more negatively colored the more content we consume that kind of paints them that way. Um, so yeah, I mean, it really is. The point I make in the article essentially is that all of these factors do play a role. Confirmation bias and motivated reasoning certainly are there, but on their own, I struggle to think that they're as powerful as negativity bias. So that's at the end of the day, the mechanism that kind of pushes towards the poles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough one because to me, I'm not completely seeing where the negativity alone is what. Yeah, I think there's still questions about what drives us to the polls because, it's a little bit of chicken and egg problem for me, right? I mean, like all these things kind of reinforce it, but it's still a little bit of a chicken egg thing that I struggle with a little bit. But and one thing about negativity bias that some of the research shows is that even if you are aware of it, like that alone isn't going to shield you from these effects.
Yeah.
So what are some ways we can sort of practically resist it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, yeah, there is research showing that even when you're aware of it, you still struggle to recognize it in yourself, and that's true of a lot of biases. Um, but what's also true is that when you do become aware of it, you may not be good at recognizing it in yourself, but you do become a lot better at recognizing it in others, and that's true kind of across the board with biases. Is that we're pretty good at calling out our peers when it comes to the sins or the biases that they commit. And so if you think about, like the scientific ecosystem, this is basically how science is able to produce such high quality, relatively bias-free work, is that even though all of the individual scientists are very biased and they're all very bad at recognizing their own biases, what they're good at is recognizing the biases of other scientists. And through competition and peer review and academic institutions, they're able to call each other out whenever studies or review pieces come out that are biased, and then those don't make it basically to the next level. They don't pass the peer review stage. And so, even though the individuals are biased, the ecosystem as a whole produces relatively bias-free content. And so you can think about the same thing happening as a society, right? If we were to learn about our biases, and what I would say is the most important one is negativity bias, even though we may not recognize it in ourselves, very well, we can recognize it in others. We can call each other out. We see a politician who is advancing a very highly negative narrative. We can say, hey, you're trying to take advantage of negativity bias here. I'm not going to buy into what you're saying. Or we see social media content creators just trying to blow up, sensationalist Twitter threads. We can say, well, I'm not going to engage with that. I recognize that what he is doing is trying to take advantage of negativity bias. So it's pretty easy for us to see it out in the world, which is helpful. So what I would say practically we can do is first and foremost just learn more about negativity bias. That'll help you recognize it out in the real world more. There's a ton of really interesting, if you're interested in reading academic literature, there's a ton of it out there on it. There's also a ton of really great books and articles kind of pointing to it. Problem is, again, because people like negativity more than positivity, not a lot of people pay attention to it. But a lot of it's really, really great stuff. So learn about it more. And then, once you do, you'll start to recognize, some of these negative emotions you start to feel whenever you hear a political narrative or see a negative news story out in the real world. And once you start to recognize that feeling, immediately become skeptical of whatever that narrative is. If you, think I'm feeling a lot of negativity right now, if this is probably negativity bias at work, you're probably right. Because the major implication of negativity bias is that essentially every political issue is tainted by some level of extra negativity, right? And so anytime you hear any kind of negative news story or narrative or what have you, your immediate reaction should be to discount how serious it seems, because chances are it's being warped in some way by negativity bias. And how much that is will depend on the issue, but that's where really critical thought comes in, and you've got to start looking into alternative news sources and counter arguments and so on. Just the initial gut negative reaction is what we're trying to back away from. And so, if people are learning about negativity bias and getting better at recognizing it, and then once they see it, stepping back from it, that should definitely help.
Well, and I think there's a lot of people are doing that sort of silently or quietly because of the social cost of something you were talking about earlier, which is calling out our peers, which is probably the way to start making some larger change. Is if it becomes more, there's less social cost, or it becomes more socially acceptable to call out our peers on this stuff. Because a lot of people today, I think, have just retreated, and they maybe not using the folks that aren't buying into the negativity as much probably are kind of quiet out there. And somehow we have to make that a thing that you get social points for. It's like somehow we have to make that be the thing that you can feel comfortable doing.
I totally agree. It's difficult. And a lot of people, I think, will step back from the negativity, but only because they don't like engaging in it, but not necessarily because they recognize that there's a subconscious negativity addiction going on within them that they're actively trying to regulate. And so I think understanding that makes it a lot easier to engage, extreme partisans. And this is kind of an issue I've got with the broader depolarization movement in general. And, if you think about most depolarization type audiences, it's usually people who are already kind of in the middle and interested in depolarizing or already depolarized themselves. And so, there's the question of how do you actually reach people at the polls? And I think this understanding of negativity bias can actually be a pretty good tool there, because, usually what people have done so far is either engage with partisans on the actual issues, which can be tough because usually there's some kind of asymmetry of information. There's a lot of arguments on either side. Like, people don't want to get bogged down in a very, technical, ideological debate. And so, like you said, they'll tend to just disengage and not, talk to those people because they just don't want to get bogged down in the specifics of a policy debate with someone who, is very, very passionate about that issue. And so what the understanding of negativity bias allows for is for you to go to them and say, this overly negative and pessimistic narrative that you're pushing, what I think is happening is that you are suffering from a negativity addiction here, that, it allows you to step above the actual fray of the specific policy issue and let them know that, there's a lot of negative narratives floating around, and there's an addiction to negativity called negativity bias that I think you should be aware of. And that, I've found personally through conversations has been pretty helpful in stepping above the actual specific policy issue and, reaching out on, kind of a more meta level, if that makes sense.
With peers are folks in a different place on the spectrum, assuming we even buy into the idea of a spectrum. Yeah,
partisan peers. Yeah. Friends of mine who have very, very partisan views.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So, because I could see that backfiring on you if you go to somebody that's thinks of themselves as sort of far away from where you are, sees you as an adversary, and you tell them you're addicted to negativity. That might not go so well.
Yeah. I mean, you got to do it carefully and with trust and so on. But I've seen it work well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think a lot of us kind of don't realize, how much you first have to build trust before you can have any of these conversations. And, we always think if we just, start hurling facts, if they just see these facts, boy, they're going to come around. But, that's never going to work unless you first have to establish trust before you can even begin having any conversation like that. Yep,
absolutely. Yeah, the trust is very important. Absolutely. But, at the same time, the trust can't be everything, right? Like once you build the trust, there's got to be a next step. And I think a lot of the, bridge building type initiatives are great and well intentioned, but, a lot of them will tend to say, once we've got this, civility and trust established, the problem will fix itself. And, in my mind, there's got to be a next step. There's got to be some kind of resolution that you build off of once that trust has been established.
Right. And some of the organizations have explicit, sort of mission that their only mission is to sort of bring people together and build the trust side, and they're not in the business of persuasion, which I guess is okay. But yeah, for a lot of people, I think it leaves them feeling, why did I spend my time doing this if at the end of the day, we're not going to move anybody? But I mean, I think there is some value to that though, too, because you're going to learn something by getting those different perspectives. And also I think a big piece of it is because of this affective polarization situation. If you talk to real people that have some of these opposing views, it'll be a little easier to humanize them, right? You'll see they're just regular people with kids, and they have the same kind of issues in life that we all have. They're just trying to get through life too. And whereas we always think of them as these caricatures that social media and other media has sort of presented to us, and our own politicians particularly, just prop up, here's what this other side looks like. They're immoral. You can't ever vote for them. You must vote for me. And we can bring that down, that we're not as far apart as a human being than we kind of thought we were if you just stay offline all the time.
And there's a lot of good research on that too. Contact theory, essentially, that if you get people together, they'll figure out that they're not so different at the end of the day. And I think that's great. But at the same time, you've got kind of a self-sorting geographically of people. So it's becoming increasingly tough to, outside of like a lab setting, to actually get people from different ends of the spectrum together for any reason that isn't, somewhat kind of forced. So it's a tough issue for sure. But yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the solution for sure, is getting people together.
Well, and we're kind of counting on that I think Peter Coleman talks about how, you kind of have to hit rock bottom before this starts to get better. And he sort of sees it as positive that there's so many people frustrated, and maybe ready to start having those conversations. Whereas even though the loud voices we see on social media might give you an indicator that that's not what the world looks like. But, we get these, and you talk about it in your paper, that a lot of this is skewed perceptions about the world because of that negativity bias. And I think, in social media, that's a perfect example, because if you go into a comment thread, who's commenting? Like the people with the most negative views, most everybody else is kind of rolled out of the conversation.
Getting the most likes, the most negative of those.
Right. So it's the negative of the negative, right? Like I say, I think people are kind of ready for something beyond this, this cycle of cynicism we've been in. They want to move past it. And I think there is an opportunity here. And I love that idea of figuring out how to make this into a some kind of a story where you can really feel like you have a purpose and make this your mission.
Yeah. A real meaningful, crusade, something that matters and is compelling, more than just, hey, we're getting together, for the sake of unity. The other example I talk about is MLK, right? I think it's very easy to look back at what MLK did and say, man, he did such a great job because he talked about love and unity and togetherness. But that's not what set his movement, the civil rights movement, apart. I mean, they were actively fighting injustice and inequality, two characteristics that were so core to what it meant to be an American, that calling out injustice and inequality rallied people around a cause because there was real evil to fight. And that's what got people excited. If he had just appealed to love and unity, I don't think the movement would have been the same. It's the identification of the evil for a good cause, right? It's finding evil, defining it, and defining it in a way that once we fight that evil, good will come of it. That is in my mind the key. And so I think coming together just for the sake of unity is kind of a tough sell for most people. I think probably for most people that are listening to this, it's probably a great sell. And for me, it is, because I recognize that that's a good on its own. But if you think about, your average partisan, stepbrother or whatever, your uncle, are they going to be galvanized by togetherness for the sake of togetherness? Maybe, probably not. So, is there an evil that we can fight that is based around, your whole perception of the world essentially is warped by this negativity addiction. And I want to help you see the light. So I'm going to get excited about fighting that evil, that warped perception of the world, because I want your, mental health to be better. I want your happiness to be better. I want you to be able to connect with your community and, your peers across the aisle in a more effective way. There's just so many personal benefits that come from depolarizing. And if we tie a lot of those to just the single cause of negativity bias and those negativity goggles that we're all wearing, it seems like there's a positive crusade to be had of taking those goggles off and helping your friends and family to take them off as well. So we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Travis, I know we went a little long, but I do appreciate your time, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation. I definitely want to follow up.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed it too. Thanks for having me on, David. We'll talk soon.
All right. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.